What is your role? What does the geography of the United States and his or her office do?
Well, the role has evolved over the years, and you would expect it to evolve over the years with the changing world map and changing relations between countries. Officially, by law, the only real responsibility of the geographer is to issue guidance on international boundaries and how they're portrayed on all U.S. government maps. And that's the limit of my authority, which actually can be kind of fun because I've found on occasion where I'm sitting around a table with a bunch of 2- and 3-star generals who are trying to change their maps to show things that might be more advantageous for them in theater, and I get the last word on that, and I say, no, sir, this is where the boundary has to go, and this is how it's shown on your map. Other than that, my authority doesn't go beyond the way boundaries are portrayed. We do chair the Foreign Names Committee of the Board of Geographic Names, which has the same oversight over names of features, and that is more complicated and more problematic than you would imagine. Just to consider the difference between calling the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, for instance. And there are literally hundreds of features which are problematic between various different countries. But the way the office has evolved over the years is it's evolved from primarily a map-making operation where we were redrawing the boundaries after the 2 world wars, with states' boundaries changing so frequently and decolonization, to actually moving into maritime boundaries, where the law of the seas and how our fisheries and economic rights in the oceans were determined, to more of an office that does analysis. And the office actually sits in the Intelligence Research Bureau of the Department of State and has for the past 35 years. And as the State Department has moved from focusing almost exclusively on regions and countries and started to work more on what we call functional issues. Those are the issues that cross boundaries and they don't neatly fit into any one region or one country. Those issues came under the authority of the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues, under the authority in terms of the analytical oversight we have for those issues. So a lot of the issues that we call smart power, soft power issues, as our Secretary of State refers to them frequently, such as refugees, human rights, early warning, international organizations affairs, environment and sustainable development, climate change, water security, those global issues analytically come within my office. So the office is divided about 50-50 in terms of half the office does technical work on mapping and imagery analysis, and about half the office does traditional objective analysis in order to inform our policymakers.
How did your career path take you to the Office of the Geographer, and then exactly how did you become the Geographer of the United States?
Well, my career path, I started out teaching, and I was teaching down in Washington, D.C. My first job out of college I hadn't even had my PhD yet. I taught at the School of International Service at American University, which didn't have a geography department. And we started having monthly meetings among a group of geographers that were teaching at various different universities in D.C., and the current geographer at the time, George Demko, who was also a Soviet specialist. And my background was in the former Soviet Union. A lot of people got trained in the Cold War era on those issues. And after about 3 or 4 years working in Washington, getting closely involved with the work that was being done at the Office of the Geographer and getting friendly with some of the colleagues there, an opening came up at the State Department for someone who understood the non-Russian areas of the former Soviet Union. And that happened to have been an area that I specialized in. The job opening, however, was not in the Office of the Geographer. It was in the Office of Regional Analysis that works on Russia and former Soviet Union. I was the person that they wanted to hire for that job, but I insisted that if I came to the State Department, I would go nowhere else other than the Office of the Geographer. So they made that job actually sit in the Office of the Geographer, focusing on the breakup of the former Soviet Union. I also dabbled in Eastern Europe, and soon after I joined the State Department, the war broke out in the Balkans, By virtue of having vacationed on the Dalmatian coast a number of times, I was, by State Department criteria, a Balkans expert. And I was thrown into the fray of humanitarian emergency response. And I gradually changed from a focus on the former Soviet Union, a regional focus, to working much more on crisis response and emergency response, humanitarian affairs, refugee affairs, and that's been a growth industry for the past 20 years, and that's really what I've hung my hat on. How I became the geographer, I don't recommend this strategy to anybody. My predecessor, Bill Wood, and one of my dear friends actually died of brain cancer about 5 years ago, and he was, I think, grooming me to take his place at the time I was his deputy, and that's how I actually came into the position.
You kind of referenced this just a minute or so ago about the Balkans. Talk a little bit about various roles your office has played in situations of genocide like in Darfur or Kosovo.
Well, we're in the Intelligence Research Bureau, and a lot of the work that the people in that bureau do are tracking bad guys and looking at military maneuvers and doing day-to-day analysis of the way armies are moving and orders are intercepted between various different commanders. And our office needed to find a different niche, I think, in order to do that, because there are people who have those types of expertise, and we needed to figure out a way to use people who are trained more in geographic tools and analysis. And I think the first real breakthrough in the work we did in the Balkans was when mass graves began to be identified from satellite imagery. And not only were mass graves identified from satellite imagery, but the imagery was declassified and used in public press briefings for our public diplomacy campaigns. And it's a very interesting skill in and of itself in how you find these mass graves. Most people are under the impression, I think, from watching some popular television shows, that you have satellites above that pick up decomposing bodies with ground penetrating heat sensing radar from 30,000 feet, and it didn't really work that way. What you usually pick up is you pick up other signatures of the way things are moving that then leads the investigator to search for the possibility of a grave. So if you see large machinery, for instance, that is easy to pick up by imagery, and then you start looking for disturbed ground and mass graves. We then developed a methodology where we would locate the time of the graves with the areas of military control to try to tie the grave sites into the command and control of areas in order to try to bring about some eventual accountability for commanders that were in charge of units and either perpetrated the genocide or, according to the Geneva Conventions, how the genocide laws are written, could have stopped a genocide from occurring. It was soon thereafter that when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, after the Dayton Peace Agreement, they created the International Criminal Tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and my office became the executive agent for intelligence sharing with the tribunals on all issues related to genocide in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And that's where we started a very comprehensive, systematic evaluation of the type of evidence we might find in United States circles. It was a unique relationship at the time, which is called the Rule 70 Agreement, where we actually worked with the investigators for the tribunals who would ask us if we had information on a certain site in a certain area, and we would provide that information at the secret level to cleared investigators working out of our embassy in The Hague for lead purposes only, because then they would have to go out and get their own evidence, because this information couldn't be used in court, not only because it was classified, but because it would be tainted because it was provided by the US government. That relationship worked very well. When it came to actual court cases, however, we found that mapping the changing sites of these mass graves over time actually held up much more strongly in court proceedings than just the satellite images of these mass graves that probably most of you are familiar with. It's very visceral when you see ground disturbed and a likelihood of hundreds of bodies being thrown into ditches and then cover it up. But as evidence in a court case, it really doesn't show you anything. It shows you that ground was disturbed. It doesn't show who did it. It doesn't necessarily show precisely when it was done. What was more compelling for court cases, and this is what the lawyers told us, was when we actually mapped these graves over time and space. And we showed a pattern of when the militaries were moving in certain places, they were only going towards one ethnic group and they were avoiding other villages, and the mass graves would soon be associated with the movements of the military groups, and you show a nice map in a court proceeding, and it was compelling evidence. So that's our first involvement. We did a lot more in Kosovo because we had a lot of experience and because we had the luxury of knowing that the NATO airstrikes were going to allow us the time to put our information together. That's where we started applying a technology of destroyed and damaged villages, where we literally had every house marked as destroyed and damaged, and what the ethnic composition of those villages were. And we even tied it into refugee resettlement processes, where we were trying to target refugees to move back to villages that were less damaged, because we had no access to the areas. We had to do it all remotely. Unfortunately, the refugees didn't listen to our plan, and when the borders were open, they came in unimpeded. But that's their choice.
What roles have your office played in terms of supporting negotiations on climate change?
Well, that's an interesting one, because even though the Director of National Intelligence has deemed that climate change is an intelligence community issue, and again, my office is part of the intelligence community, even though most of the work we do compared to the other offices in my bureau is unclassified. This is work that really needs to be done mostly by climate scientists. And we recognize that, and the work that we primarily do in my office is we support the negotiators who are negotiating with various different governments to try to figure out what the positions of the governments would be going into the negotiations. Another thing we're working on at the interagency level is to try to come up with some ideas for a baseline of measuring greenhouse gas emissions for any climate change protocol that comes into play. Because there's a lot of science that's applied to different analysis of greenhouse gas emissions, be it changes in biomass or plume analysis of atmosphere. Until you can get countries to agree on a baseline, it really doesn't matter what change detection technique that you apply. So our challenge really has been working with other governments to support the work our government does with other governments to try to get some baseline agreements in place so that science and universal science can then be applied to a baseline, so that whatever is agreed upon can be monitored consistently with one technique all over the globe.